Welcome to this introductory lesson on critical reasoning on the GMAT. In this lesson, we'll learn the basic structure of critical reasoning questions, and we'll study two types of arguments. To begin, about 1/3 of all questions in the verbal section of the GMAT will be critical reasoning questions, and these questions will typically appear in batches of 2 or 3 in a row. In general, you should spend about 2 minutes on each critical reasoning question, perhaps slightly less if you feel you need to devote more time to other question types in the verbal section. Now, the purpose of critical reasoning questions is to test your ability to reason effectively. To test this ability, you are typically presented with some kind of argument, such as this one. You are then asked a question about the given argument. Your job is to choose the correct answer from 5 answer choices. Now, the main body of text here is called the passage. The next part that contains the question is called the question stem, and these are the answer choices. Now, most arguments on the GMAT will consist of premises and a conclusion. The conclusion is what the author is trying to convince you of, and the premises are the evidence that the author uses to support the conclusion. Let's look at an example. Now, if you've ever taken a course in formal logic, this will likely be the first argument that you examined. The argument goes like this. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Here the conclusion is Socrates is mortal. This is what the author is trying to convince you of. The 2 remaining sentences are premises that support the conclusion. In other words, they provide the evidence needed to draw the conclusion. Okay, now consider this argument. It says, for the past 3 days, Gary has arrived late for work. This morning, while Gary was driving to work, his car got a flat tire. Therefore, Gary will be late for work today. In this argument, the conclusion is that Gary will be late for work today. The premises that support the conclusion are the fact that Gary has arrived late for work for the past 3 days, and Gary's car got a flat tire this morning on the way to work. Now, of these 2 arguments, which one is more convincing? In other words, which argument is stronger? Well, as you will see, a lot of critical reasoning questions on the GMAT concern the strength of a given argument. But what does it mean to say that an argument is strong? Well, we say that the strength of an argument depends on how well the conclusion follows from the premises. So in the first argument, if we accept that the first 2 premises are true, how well does the conclusion follow from these premises? Well, if it's true that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then it follows 100% that Socrates must be mortal. In this instance, the argument is as strong as any argument can possibly be. Now consider the second argument. If it's true that Gary has been late for the past 3 days, and Gary's car got a flat tire on the way to work today, how well does it follow that Gary must be late for work today? Well, it seems likely that Gary will be late, but I'm not as certain about this conclusion as I am about the conclusion regarding Socrates. So while the Gary argument might be somewhat strong, it's not as strong as the Socrates argument. Now, it's important to mention that arguments like the Socrates argument are very rare on the GMAT. This kind of argument is called a deductive argument, and in deductive arguments, the conclusion is guaranteed. In other words, if we assume that the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow from them. Now, in real life, we rarely have such certainties, and the GMAT reflects this. As such, you will find very few critical reasoning questions on the GMAT that feature deductive arguments. Instead, most questions on the GMAT will feature inductive arguments like this one, where the conclusions are not guaranteed. Now, an important feature of inductive arguments is that since they are less than perfect, we can often weaken or strengthen them by adding new premises or modifying existing premises. For example, notice what happens when we take this argument about Gary and change it so that he has been late for work for the past 53 days. This new premise would seem to strengthen the conclusion that Gary will be late for work today. Now, does this mean that the conclusion is guaranteed? Absolutely not. It's still possible that Gary will arrive to work on time today. Now, what if we modify the argument further and say that instead of 1 flat tire, Gary had 4 flat tires and his engine exploded? Does this guarantee the conclusion? Well, this new information certainly seems to strengthen the conclusion that Gary will be late, but it's still possible that he could arrive to work on time. For example, he might just leave his car and walk to work. Alternatively, notice what happens when we take the original argument and add the premise, Gary's house is 1 block from work. By adding this premise, we are weakening the argument. Sure, it's still possible that Gary will arrive late for work today, but the fact that he lives so close weakens the extent to which the conclusion follows from the premises. So the two important takeaways here are, on the GMAT, the conclusions in most arguments are not guaranteed, and most arguments can be strengthened or weakened by adding or altering the premises. Now, whenever we need to determine the strength of an argument on the GMAT, it's important to note that we must always accept the premises as true. So when determining the strength of the original argument involving Gary, we cannot question the truth of the given premises. For example, we cannot say that this argument is weak because Gary did not get a flat tire, or that Gary was not late for work for the past 3 days. These premises must be accepted as true. So when gauging the strength of any argument, we must examine only the degree to which the conclusion follows from the premises. Now consider this argument, for example. All pigs can fly, Mount Everest is a pig, therefore Mount Everest can fly. Is this a strong argument? Well, since we must accept the premises as true, and all pigs can indeed fly, and Mount Everest is a pig, then it must be the case that Mount Everest can fly. Since the conclusion definitely follows from the premises, this argument is perfect. Conversely, changing the conclusion to read, therefore Mount Everest cannot fly, would make this argument invalid. Even though we all know that mountains cannot fly, this is a bad argument because the conclusion does not follow from the given premises. Now, in addition to having premises and conclusions, most arguments share a third component. Most arguments have assumptions that are needed to make the conclusion follow. Now, an assumption is essentially an unstated premise that is necessary to help us reach the given conclusion. For example, in the argument about Gary, what sort of unstated assumptions are required to help us reach the conclusion that Gary will be late today? Well, we need to assume that Gary's previous record of lateness will be repeated today. We also need to assume that if Gary is to fix his flat tire, the time it will take him to do so will exceed the amount of time before work starts. And we need to assume that Gary has no other means by which to get to work on time. Now, there are other unstated assumptions here, but you get the idea. Okay, now that we've identified the 3 main components of an argument, the general structure of most arguments goes something like this. We take some premises and add some assumptions, and this allows us to arrive at a conclusion. Notice that I made the assumptions gray here to indicate that assumptions are unstated within any given argument. Okay, so this is the basic structure of an argument. Now let's summarize. In this lesson, we examined the pieces that make up an argument, we learned how to determine the strength of an argument, and we learned that we must accept all premises as true. In the next lesson, we'll practice locating the premises, assumptions, and conclusions within a given argument.